David Chen had worked maintenance rounds on Station Harmony 9 for 8 months, and in that time he'd learned to recognize every sound the massive structure made, the hum of artificial gravity generators, the whisper of air recycling systems, and the subtle vibrations that indicated ships docking at the outer pylons. What he'd never heard, despite countless encounters, was the voice of the woman the station's inhabitants called the Ghost. She moved through the corridors like silence given form, her tall frame draped in simple gray clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her pointed ears marked her as one of the dozen alien species that called Harmony 9 home, but unlike the gregarious Altarians or the perpetually debating Centaurian diplomats, she existed in a bubble of absolute quiet that made other passengers unconsciously lower their voices when she passed. 3 years, muttered Dar Patel during their weekly coffee break in the maintenance sector's break room. 3 years she's been here, and nobody's heard her speak a single word. Maybe her species communicates differently, suggested Lou, the head of environmental systems, stirring synthetic sweetener into her cup with the methodical precision of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. Telepathy, pheromones, something we can't detect. The xenolinguistics team tried that, Dr. Patel replied, pulling up data files on his tablet. Brought in specialists from 5 different telepathic species, had them attempt contact using every known form of nonverbal communication. Nothing. She doesn't respond to anything. David absently traced patterns on the break room table, remembering his encounters with the mysterious woman during his daily rounds. She appeared in different sections of the station at regular intervals, moving with purpose that suggested intelligence and awareness rather than aimless wandering. But she never acknowledged other beings, never responded to greetings, never showed any sign that she perceived the social world around her. "What's her story?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would be frustratingly incomplete. Listed in the refugee database as displaced person seeking asylum, Dr. Patel read from his files. Arrived on a damaged transport ship with minimal documentation. Name listed as, hold on, the pronunciation guide is complex. Kirillin of the Ethon Collective. Ethon Collective, Lou repeated, frowning. That doesn't ring any bells. Are they one of the Outer Rim species? That's where it gets interesting, Dr. Patel said, scrolling through increasingly sparse data entries. I can find almost nothing about her people in the galactic databases. A few references to an artistic culture known for telepathic abilities, some mentions of advanced consciousness research, but most of the files seem to have been purged. David felt something cold settle in his stomach. In galactic politics, purged files usually meant one thing: extinction events that were too politically sensitive to discuss openly. She's alone, he said quietly, the realization hitting him like a physical weight. She might be the only one left. The break room fell silent as the implications sank in. Harmony 9 housed refugees from dozens of conflicts, beings who had lost homes, families, entire communities to the endless small wars that plagued the outer sectors. But complete cultural extinction was something else entirely, a loss so profound that it challenged basic assumptions about survival and continuity. The counseling staff has tried everything, Dr. Patel continued, his voice softer now. Trauma specialists, grief counselors, even brought in practitioners of obscure therapeutic techniques from the rim worlds. She attends the sessions, never misses an appointment, but she just sits there. Doesn't respond, doesn't react, doesn't acknowledge that anyone else exists. David finished his coffee and stood up, his maintenance schedule calling him back to the endless rounds that kept Harmony 9 functioning. But as he prepared to leave, he found himself thinking about a woman who moved through crowded corridors like a ghost, carrying the weight of being possibly the last speaker of her language, the final keeper of her people's memories. Maybe, he said, pausing at the break room door, she's not refusing to communicate. Maybe she's protecting something. The afternoon brought him to Sector 7, where the station's observation lounges offered sweeping views of the star system's traffic patterns. He was calibrating atmospheric sensors when he noticed her sitting alone in the far corner, silhouetted against the vast backdrop of space. She sat perfectly still, watching ships arrive and depart with the intensity of someone looking for something specific. David had seen her in this position dozens of times during his rounds, always in the same chair, always facing the same direction. For the first time, he wondered what she was watching for. A rescue ship that would never come? Familiar vessel configurations that might indicate others of her kind had survived? Or was she simply maintaining a vigil for something that had been lost beyond recovery? As he worked, David found himself stealing glances at her profile. She was beautiful in a way that seemed carved from starlight, elegant features that suggested intelligence and depth, with an aura of sadness so profound it seemed to bend the air around her. Her pointed ears twitched occasionally, responding to sounds he couldn't identify, suggesting that her awareness extended far beyond her apparent disconnection from social interaction. When he finished the sensor calibration, David packed his equipment quietly, not wanting to disturb her contemplation. But as he reached the lounge exit, something made him pause and look back. She was still motionless, still watching the stars, but something about her posture suggested she was aware of his presence. For a moment, he considered approaching, offering some gesture of acknowledgement or companionship. But the weight of her silence felt too sacred to intrude upon, so he left her to her vigil and continued his rounds. That evening, David found himself researching the Ethon Collective in the station's archives, using his maintenance access codes to dig deeper into databases that civilian residents couldn't reach. What he found made him understand why Carolyn moved through the world like a ghost. Her people weren't just extinct, they had been systematically erased. And she was carrying the weight of being the only person in the universe who remembered they had ever existed at all. The archives painted a picture that made David's hands shake as he scrolled through classified files that should have required security clearances far above his pay grade. The Ethon Collective had been a peaceful civilization known throughout the Outer Rim for their artistic achievements and advanced understanding of consciousness research. Their homeworld, Ethon Prime, had been a center of learning where telepathic species came to study the deeper mysteries of mental connection and shared awareness. Then, 18 months ago, everything had stopped. The official reports were sanitized to the point of meaninglessness, territorial dispute resolved, population relocation completed, administrative transition in progress. But buried in maintenance logs and supply requisitions, David found the truth: systematic extermination carried out by the hegemony of pure thought, a militant faction that viewed telepathic species as fundamental threats to galactic security. Telepathic contamination, the hegemony's propaganda called it. Mental invasion that undermines individual consciousness and threatens the sovereignty of free-thinking beings. David stared at the data, feeling sick. Ethon Prime had been sterilized from orbit, its population centers turned to glass in a coordinated strike that left no survivors on the planet's surface. The few Ethon who had been off-world at the time, traders, diplomats, students, had been systematically hunted down by hegemony operatives who viewed their very existence as an ongoing threat to galactic stability. Jesus, he whispered, understanding now why Carolyn moved through the world like a ghost. She wasn't just grieving, she was hiding. Speaking, interacting, acknowledging her own existence might draw attention from people who had already proven they would kill entire civilizations to eliminate what they saw as mental contamination. The immigration records showed that she had arrived on Harmony 9 aboard a damaged freighter, listed as cargo rather than passenger, probably smuggled to safety by someone who understood the danger she faced. Her documentation was minimal: name, species designation, and a single note that made David's chest tighten: last verified survivor of Ethon Collective. Cultural preservation priority. Cultural preservation priority. She wasn't just a refugee, she was a living repository of an entire civilization's memory, the only person left who remembered her people's language, traditions, and achievements. The weight of that responsibility was beyond anything David could imagine carrying. Over the following weeks, he found himself paying closer attention to her routines during his maintenance rounds. She moved through the station with purpose that suggested complex internal organization rather than aimless wandering. Morning visits to the hydroponics bay, where she would stand for exactly 23 minutes among the growing plants, never touching but observing with intensity that suggested deep significance. Afternoon sessions in the observation lounges, always facing the same direction, watching ships with the patience of someone waiting for something specific. Evening rounds brought her to the cultural archives, where she would sit for hours in the xenological research section, surrounded by texts about extinct civilizations and lost languages. David began timing his equipment checks to coincide with her visits, watching from a distance as she read about species that existed now only in historical records. She's studying extinction, he realized one evening, observing her careful examination of texts about the Valdres Empire, a telepathic civilization that had vanished 3 centuries earlier under circumstances suspiciously similar to what had happened to the Ethon Collective. The pattern became clear. Kira Lin was researching her own situation, trying to understand how other soul survivors had coped with being the last speaker of their language, the final keeper of their culture's memory. The weight of her solitude was methodical, systematic. She was preparing for a lifetime of being the only person who remembered that her people had ever existed. David began leaving small gestures in places where she would find them. Fresh flowers from the hydroponics bay, placed on the reading table where she spent her evenings. Books of poetry from various cultures, selected for their themes of memory and preservation. Handwritten notes in multiple languages offering simple words of comfort. You are seen. You are not forgotten. Your people's memory lives. He never signed the notes, never lingered to observe her reactions. The gifts were meant to be anonymous acknowledgments that someone on the station understood, at least partially, the magnitude of what she was carrying. The breakthrough in his research came when he discovered archived recordings of Ethon speech patterns in the cultural preservation databases. Their language was musical, built on tonal variations that carried emotional as well as semantic meaning. Names, particularly, were complex constructions that incorporated family history, personal achievements, and spiritual connections to their homeworld. Kira Lin, according to the linguistic analysis software, meant something like, keeper of memories who bridges the space between what was and what must be. Her name itself was a prophecy of what she had become, the living connection between her lost people and whatever future might emerge from their absence. David spent hours practicing the correct pronunciation, studying the tonal patterns until he could say her name the way her own people would have said it. The process felt sacred somehow, like learning to speak a prayer in a language that had no other speakers left alive. When their paths crossed during his evening rounds, David began offering quiet greetings that acknowledged her presence without demanding response. Good evening, Kira Lin, spoken with the proper tonal inflections, followed by respectful distance that asked nothing from her but offered everything he could give, recognition that she existed, that her name had meaning, that someone on this station saw her as more than a ghost drifting through empty corridors. She never responded, never acknowledged his words with anything more than a slight pause in her movement. But something about her posture suggested awareness, as if his voice was reaching through the protective silence she had built around herself. David continued his quiet campaign of recognition, speaking her name correctly each time they met, leaving gentle reminders that she was seen and valued despite her isolation. He wasn't trying to force her back into social interaction, he was simply maintaining a steady presence that said, "You are not alone in carrying this weight." What he didn't know was that each correctly pronounced syllable of her name was creating tiny cracks in the wall of silence that Kira Lin had built to protect the last fragments of her people's existence. And cracks, given enough gentle pressure over time, could become doorways back into the world of the living. 3 months into his quiet campaign of recognition, David had established a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Each morning, when his rounds took him past the hydroponics bay, he would offer a gentle, "Good morning, Kira Lin," in the proper Ethon tonal patterns. Each afternoon, passing through the observation lounges, he would acknowledge her presence with, "The stars are beautiful today, aren't they, Kira Lin," spoken softly enough that only she could hear. Each evening, when their paths crossed near the cultural archives, he would bid her good night with the same careful pronunciation that honored her name's true meaning. She never responded. But David had begun to notice subtle changes, the way her shoulders seemed less rigid when he spoke, how her pointed ears would twitch slightly at the sound of her properly pronounced name, the occasional pause in her movement that suggested she was listening to more than just his words. "You know she's watching you, right? Dar." Patel mentioned during one of their coffee breaks, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone discussing a sensitive topic. The ghost. She started timing her movements to intersect with your maintenance rounds. David felt his cheeks warm. I'm not trying to intrude on her space. I think everyone deserves to have their name spoken correctly. I'm not criticizing, Dr. Patel assured him quickly. Actually, the counseling staff has noticed changes in her behavior patterns. She's spending more time in common areas, less time hiding in isolated sections. Dr. Martinez thinks your presence might be having a therapeutic effect. I'm not a therapist, David protested, though he couldn't deny the flutter of hope that accompanied Dr. Patel's words. I'm just trying to be respectful. Sometimes, Dr. Patel said gently, respect is the most therapeutic thing you can offer someone. That afternoon brought unexpected complications when David's rounds were interrupted by a security alert in the station's diplomatic quarter. A group of hegemony representatives had arrived for routine inspections, their presence sending ripples of tension through the refugee communities that called Harmony 9 home. David's stomach clenched as he realized the implications. The hegemony's routine inspections of refugee stations were notorious throughout the sector, systematic searches for telepathic individuals who might have escaped their previous purges. Their operatives were trained to identify the subtle behavioral markers that distinguish telepathic species from those who communicated through conventional means. Kirillin would be in immediate danger if they detected her presence. He found her in the observation lounge, sitting in her usual chair but with a tension in her posture that suggested she was aware of the hegemony's arrival. Her normally perfect stillness had been replaced by barely contained readiness, like a prey animal prepared to flee at the first sign of detection. Kirillin, David said quietly, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. There are hegemony inspectors on the station. You need to. She turned to look at him for the first time in all their encounters, her luminous eyes wide with something between terror and desperate hope. The direct eye contact was so unexpected that David felt his words die in his throat, struck by the intelligence and pain he could see in her gaze. For a moment, they stared at each other across the small distance that had always separated them. Then, moving with the fluid grace that characterized all her actions, Kirillin rose from her chair and began walking toward the lounge exit. David followed, understanding without words that she was trusting him to help her navigate this crisis. His knowledge of the station's maintenance systems allowed him to guide her through service corridors and hidden passages that the hegemony inspectors wouldn't know existed, while his access codes could get them into secure areas where refugees often hid during dangerous situations. They moved in silence through the station's hidden spaces, David leading while Kirillin followed with the soundless steps that had earned her the nickname Ghost. Twice they paused in maintenance alcoves while hegemony patrols passed nearby, their scanner equipment humming with frequencies designed to detect telepathic activity. During one particularly tense moment, crammed together in a ventilation access corridor while voices approached from both directions, David felt Kirillin's hand brush against his arm. The contact was electric, carrying information that bypassed language entirely. Gratitude, trust, and something deeper that might have been recognition of kindness offered freely without expectation of return. The crisis passed after 6 hours, with the hegemony inspectors departing as abruptly as they had arrived. David guided Kirillin back to the inhabited sections of the station through the same hidden routes they had used to escape, emerging in a quiet corridor near her quarters as if they had simply taken an extended maintenance tour. "You're safe now," he said softly, speaking her name with the careful pronunciation that had become second nature. "They're gone, Kirillin." She stood facing him in the corridor's dim lighting, her expression carrying emotions too complex for David to interpret. For a moment, he thought she might speak, her lips parted slightly, as if words were gathering just behind the silence she had maintained for so long. Instead, she reached out and touched his hand briefly, the contact carrying the same electric intensity as their earlier brush in the maintenance corridor. Then she turned and walked toward her quarters, leaving David standing alone with the profound sense that something fundamental had shifted between them. The next morning brought changes that the entire station noticed. Kira Lin appeared in the main dining hall during the breakfast period, not eating, but present in a way that acknowledged the social space around her. She spent longer periods in the common areas, no longer avoiding crowds but moving through them with the same fluid grace while seeming somehow more present, more aware of the people around her. Dr. Martinez, the head counselor, approached David during his afternoon break with questions that mixed professional curiosity with genuine concern. "She's showing signs of social re-engagement, Dr. Martinez reported, consulting her tablet with the enthusiasm of someone whose theoretical frameworks were being validated by real-world results. Increased interaction with environmental stimuli, longer periods spent in populated areas, and what appears to be selective attention to specific social cues." "That's good, right?" David asked, though he suspected the answer was more complicated than a simple yes or no. "It's progress," Dr. Martinez confirmed. "But it's also potentially dangerous. When someone has maintained protective isolation for extended periods, sudden social re-engagement can be overwhelming. She's beginning to lower the psychological barriers that have kept her safe, which makes her more vulnerable to emotional trauma if something goes wrong." David felt the weight of responsibility settle around him like a physical presence. His gentle campaign of recognition had created cracks in Kira Lin's protective silence, but cracks could become fractures if handled incorrectly. Whatever was happening between them required careful attention to avoid causing more harm than healing. That evening, when their paths crossed near the cultural archives, David offered his usual greeting with extra gentleness. "Good evening, Kira Lin. I hope you found peace in today's quiet moments." She stopped walking. For the first time in 3 years of absolute silence, Kira Lin of the Ethon Collective stopped, turned, and looked directly at the human who had learned to speak her name like a prayer offered to keep her people's memory alive. The moment stretched between them like a bridge being built across an impossible distance. Kira Lin stood motionless in the corridor, her luminous eyes fixed on David's face with an intensity that seemed to see through him to something beyond. Her lips parted, and for the first time in 3 years, sound emerged from her throat, not words yet, but the whisper of breath that preceded speech. "Say it again," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that David's human ears could barely perceive, tones that spoke of loss and hope and the courage required to break self-imposed silence. David felt his heart stop, restart, and begin beating in rhythms that had nothing to do with normal physiology. The words she had spoken were in perfect standard Galactic, but underneath the familiar language, he could hear echoes of something else. The musical cadences of a dead tongue trying to remember how to shape itself around alien sounds. "Kira Lin," he said softly, putting every ounce of respect and recognition into the pronunciation he had practiced for months. "Your name is Kira Lin, keeper of memories who bridges the space between what was and what must be." The translation of her name's meaning seemed to hit her like a physical force. Her hand flew to her throat, eyes widening with something that might have been wonder or terror or the first stirring of hope she had allowed herself to feel since losing everything she had ever known. You learned," she whispered, her voice gaining strength as neural pathways long dormant began to remember their function. "You learned to say it properly." "I researched your people," David admitted, stepping slightly closer but maintaining respectful distance. "I found archived recordings, linguistic analysis software. I wanted to honor your name the way your family would have spoken it." The mention of family brought tears to her eyes. The first emotional display David had ever witnessed from her. They tracked down her cheeks like liquid starlight, carrying 3 years of grief that had been held too long in silence. "My family," she repeated, the words seeming to unlock something fundamental in her ability to speak. "My people. They called me Kira Lin Athenmore in the old tongue. She who remembers the songs that must not be forgotten. But I have been forgetting, David Chen. In the silence, pieces of them have been disappearing." The fact that she knew his name sent a shock through David's system. "You've been watching me." "I have been watching everyone," Kira Lin replied, her voice growing stronger with each word as unused vocal cords remembered their purpose. "But you were the only one who saw me as more than a ghost. You spoke my name like it mattered. Like I mattered." She moved closer, her movements carrying the same fluid grace but now directed toward connection rather than avoidance. Do you know what it means to be the last speaker of a language? Every word I forget, every tradition I cannot remember perfectly, is another small death of my people. The silence was protection. If I did not speak, I could not accidentally lose pieces of them through imperfect memory. David felt the profound weight of what she was sharing, the impossible burden of being a living museum, responsible for preserving an entire civilization's worth of culture, language, and tradition with perfect accuracy. The magnitude of that responsibility was beyond anything he could comprehend. But you're not forgetting, he said gently. You're preserving. And preservation doesn't require perfect isolation. How can you be certain? Carolyn asked, her voice carrying the vulnerability of someone who had spent 3 years building walls around her heart to protect the last fragments of her world. Because, David said, reaching slowly toward her hand and stopping just short of contact, waiting for permission, cultures survive through sharing, not through hiding. Your people's memory isn't more fragile than you think, it's stronger. Strong enough to survive translation, adaptation, even imperfect transmission. Strong enough to live in new voices that learn to speak their names with love. Carolyn looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, then slowly placed her fingers against his palm. The contact was electric, carrying the same intensity as their earlier touches but now amplified by conscious choice and mutual recognition. Will you, she said, her voice trembling with the courage required to ask for what she needed most, will you help me remember how to share what I carry? I have been alone with my people's voices for so long that I have forgotten how to let others hear them. Always, David replied without hesitation. For as long as you'll let me. What followed was the slow, careful process of cultural resurrection. Carolyn began sharing fragments of Ethon history, language, and tradition with David, making him the first repository of her people's memory beyond herself. She taught him phrases in the old tongue, their meaning layered with cultural context that transformed simple words into windows into an entire way of seeing the universe. In return, David helped her navigate the delicate process of re-engaging with social interaction. He accompanied her to station events, serving as a bridge between her growing willingness to connect and the community's curiosity about the woman who had been silent for so long. His presence gave her courage to speak, while her stories gave him understanding of loss and preservation that changed his perspective on what it meant to be human in a universe full of beings struggling to maintain their identity across impossible distances. 6 months after she first spoke his name, Carolyn had become one of the station's most valued cultural advisors, sharing her knowledge of consciousness research and artistic traditions with scholars who traveled from across the sector to learn from the last keeper of Ethon wisdom. But more than that, she had become the center of David's universe, the woman whose voice had returned from silence to teach him that love could bloom even in the spaces left empty by incomprehensible loss. Do you regret it? She asked one evening as they sat together in the observation lounge, watching ships arrive and depart while she no longer searched for rescue that would never come. Becoming the keeper of a dead civilization's memory. David looked at her, no longer a ghost but a woman whose presence filled his world with meaning he had never imagined possible, and smiled. I didn't become the keeper of a dead civilization's memory, he said, taking her hand and feeling the electric connection that had grown from recognition into something deeper than individual identity. I became the partner of someone whose people live on in every word she speaks, every tradition she shares, every moment she chooses connection over isolation. Carolyn leaned against his shoulder, her pointed ears twitching with contentment as she spoke a phrase in the old tongue that needed no translation, words that meant home found in unexpected places, love discovered in the act of being truly known. And in the corridor where she had first broken her silence by asking him to say her name again, the echo of her voice had changed everything. Not just for her, but for the understanding that some forms of preservation require not isolation but the courage to let others learn the songs that must not be forgotten.